First, I want to start by thanking Matthew for his very kind words. And I guess it is, you know how long you've been at NYU. And that's when we first met. I have to tell you a funny story that our colleague, Robert Chazen, told me, oh, there's this new dean, you have to meet this guy. He was brand new. So we made an appointment for 4 o'clock. And we talked until 8. Now, you could say it's a sign of how loquacious we both might be, but actually it was the start of a very good friendship. And I have to tell you, those of you who've worked in universities know that there are people that you have a very friendly relationship with and you work with. And you don't always know if the friendship is, I'm not going to say genuine, because it is genuine, but there's an instrumental question. And it only gets tested when the person has to give you advice that if you were working in that person's job, they might not give you. And when they do, you know it's your real friend. And that's Matthew, really the type of friend that always gave us the kind of advice that we really needed. So I thank him again and hope to repay this gratitude of his in many ways in the future. So thank you. Now, we are going to be getting into a topic that I got interested in for several reasons. Let us begin first with the funny fact that John the Baptist is the first Jew who is reported to have actually received his name at a circumcision ceremony. And this is a pretty funny fact, because if I'd ask you, how do you know that this custom, which is observed until today at circumcision ceremonies, existed in the first century, the evidence is the New Testament in the Gospels. Another curiosity, we know that Jews have a portion of the prophets read every single week. And this is what a boy does at his bar mitzvah, and in the modern movements, a girl at her bat mitzvah in most parts of the Jewish community. And who is the first person we know by name who read a prophetic portion in a synagogue? None other than Jesus. And now we get to the prodigal son. John Sexton is actually the originator of discussing the prodigal son in relation to me. I toyed with speaking today about the prodigal son. But the prodigal son has a problem, and I'll tell you what that is. Attempts to connect the prodigal son to a Jewish context don't work. Here's why. Presumably, according to some commentators, the reason why the son who remained is frustrated is because he assumed he'd get a double portion of inheritance because the Torah requires that for the oldest son in the family. The only problem is that by this time, the first century CE, in the Jewish community, that pattern had been replaced in 2 different ways. First of all, they had created the idea of gifts in anticipation of death, otherwise known as wills that actually cause a transfer to happen before death. So almost nobody was giving a double portion to a firstborn son. But second of all, the girls in the family and the wife, or even sometimes wives, had managed to get online first. And this is because of the settlement that was required to a wife upon death of divorce, as well as the requirement that unmarried daughters be supported before any of the estate could be divided. So the bottom line is that the prodigal son appears to be, as beautiful a parable as it may be, disconnected from the Jewish context of Christianity. So for that reason, you won't be hearing tonight about the prodigal son. But actually, our job tonight is not actually to try to understand how Christianity emerges from a Jewish context. That's what's usually done. Our job is to ask how Christian sources that don't aim to tell us anything at all about Judaism actually tell us about the Jews and Judaism. This is a kind of a reverse of what usually happens, which is why I started with those 2 examples of Jesus and John the Baptist. Now, to understand this, we have to say a few things in introduction. First of all, there is obviously a question about the historical facticity of New Testament materials. Now, actually, from our point of view, to some extent, that doesn't matter, because it doesn't really matter whether the specific event took place. What matters is whether or not the person who had heard the book or read the book would assume that the thing is plausible. So, for example, if we're being told that there are Jews located in Athens Would a person living at the end of the first century actually believe such a thing? Now, this is sort of like if I made a movie that's set in New York City. Now, if the events take place in buildings and streets that we all know, we regard it as plausible. That part of the story has to be historically true for anybody to believe, even in those parts which we might think from our academic point of view might be more mythic. So the second point I want to make is, again, that we are not talking about the Jewish background of the New Testament. We're talking about how the New Testament can teach us about Judaism. So from this point of view, the reliability level can be considered much greater, because these are just off-the-cuff statements that are in the text to provide its ambiance. And so if they tell us that this is how you traveled to Damascus, then we have to assume it was, because otherwise that type of thing would not be there. Now, we also have to point out that much of the material that we find in the New Testament fits perfectly into what we know from other Jewish sources. And it's precisely because of that that we should believe this. Let's return to our example of Jesus and the reading of the prophetic reading, what's called until today the Haftarah. Now, if we read rabbinic texts from slightly later, we find the same thing going on. The Mishnah, which is edited circa 200, in the name of rabbis reaching back, but all after the destruction of the temple in 70, discusses this very thing. So when I find it's also in the New Testament, it's perfectly plausible. It just turns out that the New Testament may be my earliest piece of evidence. And then when we find, this one may seem even funny, when we find that there is a debate over what to do if an animal falls into a pit, and that this debate is going on in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the New Testament, and in the Mishnah, and I should have said on the Sabbath, that's what we're talking about, you take the animal out on the Sabbath, you can plausibly believe that animals fell into pits. I told you it might sound funny. Now, I've decided to limit the talk today to the book of Acts. There are a number of reasons for this. One is that it spans two major periods in the early history of Christianity, namely the period of what we could call the Jewish-oriented land of Israel, Palestinian earliest gospel period, and running into the period which normally we would consider the period of the Pauline mission, etc. Now, we say this despite the fact that most scholars believe that the Pauline epistles predate the finished Gospels. But nonetheless, it's clear that the setting of the Gospels is earlier, and the setting of the epistles is later. Now, having decided this fact, we have to say just a little bit about Acts. Acts probably dates to something like 75, 80, 85, something like that. And Acts is understood to have been written by the same author as Luke. Now, people say this all the time. There is a little bit of a problem, because when you read Acts in the middle of the book, suddenly some "we" appears. And nobody knows who this "we" is. Now, most scholars believe that Luke and Acts have to be by the same author because of the fact that Luke and Acts have the same Greek style and other such considerations. It is a bit jarring when you're just reading, say, well, who's this "we"? And there are various theories about it. So I simply caution you that it's not 100% clear that it's definitely a unified work. But for our purposes, that's really not too important. So let's start out with some examples of what we can learn. And I think we want to bear in mind as well, in the context of our theme today, the question of the extent to which some of these things might also serve the larger fields of ancient studies beyond simply what we're doing today, which is seeing how this type of evidence fits in the context of explaining the Jews and Judaism. Now let's start with the Jewish diaspora. By the way, what I've done is to take passages, arrange them by topic, so that we can have a logical progression through topics and not discuss them in the order in which they appear in the book of Acts. So if anybody is wondering why we're going to be jumping around, that will explain it. So now what interests me in this passage is that we hear about devout Jews from all over the place already in the first century. And they all seem to have various languages, and this is, of course, the passage about speaking in tongues. But we have Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, all these different places. And by the way, interestingly, Jews and proselytes. Now, if you look at a map of the Jewish communities of the diaspora as they were spread, This map is actually imperfect because I couldn't find a good map that gave us a picture of the Eastern diaspora. There's a Western Hellenistic diaspora, which of course includes Turkey and Asia Minor, is part of that Hellenistic diaspora. And then there is a diaspora to the East. And what you have here is a list of people who are Jews living there already. Now, why is this significant? In general terms, you hear all the time that these Jewish communities were created by the Roman destruction of Judea as a result of the Jewish revolt of 66 to 73 CE. This is simply not true. The first diaspora communities in what we'll call the Greco-Roman communities were created way, way before that. And of course, the Mesopotamian diaspora was created by the exiles of Assyria and Babylonia towards the east. But the point I want to make about the Greco-Roman diaspora is that it could not have been created by the destruction of the temple because it is simply too well developed, and we're going to see this later on, by the time Paul gets to these communities. Now, if we go earlier in time, there is an entire set of documents preserved or forged, it's a matter of debate, by Josephus, which argue one by one, the early date of Jewish communities all over the Mediterranean basin, and therefore the rights essentially of citizenship of these Jews. Now, Miriam Pucci Ben Ze'ev has argued at great length that these documents actually are real. And this fits in very well with what we see because we can trace a development from those documents that are preserved in Josephus, that are earlier than Josephus himself, of course, to the evidence from the New Testament, to the archaeological evidence of these communities, which is for the most part 3rd to 5th centuries, and then from there to the complete development of the European Jewish diaspora as Jews moved further north into areas like Cologne by the 5th century in Germany and places like that. Now, we also have further evidence, Cyprus, Cyrene in North Africa, right? Antioch, by the way, is Antakya, which is in today's Turkey. Now, in any case, what I want you to understand is that on the one hand, you could say, we already knew this from before, but it's the New Testament that fills in the chronology and argues for the accuracy of the early accounts of these places. And furthermore, it's New Testament studies, by the way, which spurred scholars to create full studies of the Jewish diaspora to which, we will see in a few minutes, Paul went. Now, the interesting point here is that these studies, and this was the point that was being made in our introductory remarks tonight, are generally not used by people who study those regions of Asia Minor, etc. Now, it's also interesting to note that by this time, Jews have all types of Greek-type names. And this is very common. It's very similar, but Paul and Saul is the best example. And furthermore, we see that proselytes are being discussed. This whole question of proselytes is itself a very complex historical issue. I simply point out to you that the New Testament does testify, indeed, to proselytes among the Jewish community. Now, again, we have foreigners in Jerusalem. Why? Because many of these people were coming to Jerusalem for the various festivals. And here you have even this Ethiopian eunuch, and who is probably evidence of the fact that there were non-Jews who came to Jerusalem to worship the one God. This gets into a whole other question of the extent to which monotheism was spreading in the Greco-Roman world, previous to the rise of Christianity, which of course ultimately turned the Greco-Roman world to monotheism. And we have some evidence in Jewish sources for this, as well as material pertaining to semi-proselytes, people who observe some Jewish customs throughout the diaspora. Now, the languages of these people were essentially Greek, and to some extent also either Hebrew or Aramaic. Now, you know that the term Hellenist, in its origins in the New Testament, simply means somebody who speaks Greek, not somebody who's been influenced by Greek influence. And the so-called Hebrews, we don't exactly know if they are Hebrews or simply means speakers of a Jewish language, which could be Aramaic. Now, we're in good company with this problem because of the fact that Josephus writes in the introduction to his Greek edition of his War that he had written an earlier version of War in the language of his people and sent it out. Now, most scholars think that's Aramaic. It could be Hebrew, but we don't have it anyhow, so it doesn't make much of a difference if you get a Hebrew Josephus. It's just a modern translation. But in any case, it's very clear that there were people who spoke Greek in Jerusalem, there were people who spoke Hebrew, and these languages were very much coexisting. This actually is something which is confirmed by numerous inscriptions throughout the land of Israel, and it's also confirmed in documents from the time of the Second Jewish Revolt of 132 to 5. Now, admittedly, these and the Mishnaic evidence for Greek words being used in the land of Israel, these, if they hung alone, might tell us that indeed these languages were both being used in the land of Israel. But when you open up the New Testament, you find that Greek speakers were all over the place in the land during the period we're talking about. Now again, this problem about Hebrew versus Aramaic, although people like to say that Aramaic was a language being used, the use of the Greek specifically to tell us that it was Hebrew being spoken leaves one to wonder if perhaps it was. So this gets into the question of the role of Aramaic versus Hebrew. You know that Jesus obviously spoke Aramaic. Why do I say obviously? The New Testament, you can't tell this maybe in your English Bible, has transliterations in the Greek text of Aramaic words. For example, Reka, which means a fool, appears a couple of times. When Jesus is in his last minutes, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He doesn't say, Lama azavtani, which is Hebrew. He says, Lama shibaktani, which comes out in your Grecicized, Anglicized as zebaktani. Now, this particular translation, I thought when I first looked at the New Testament when I was in high school, I thought that this was just ignorance. It's not. It's the Aramaic translation. And I think there's more evidence for that and the likelihood that the New Testament was originally in Aramaic because so much of it is Galilean. But Judeans were still speaking Hebrew. So it fits in perfectly well that perhaps in Jerusalem there may have been Hebrew speakers. But I have to tell you, I don't think one can make a convincing argument one way or the other. And it's just something that can't be resolved, even though I tend to believe that there were still some Hebrew speakers around. There is the famous story of the Judean maid of Rabbi Judah the Prince, who edited the Mishnah, who would supply the students with information about Hebrew words they didn't know because they were Aramaic speakers in the Galilee, and she had come from Judea and knew Hebrew better than they did. Now, another interesting example of kind of off-the-cuff information about a Jewish observance. The Torah says that a person on the Sabbath is not supposed to leave his or her place. This is a very vague statement. Some Jewish sectarians even thought that you had to stay in your house on the whole Sabbath. But normative Jewish approaches assumed that there was some distance within your city area that it was permissible to travel. Now, the rabbis came up with the idea, based on their interpretation of the Torah, and we only have this in later sources, that it was permissible to go 2,000 cubits, which is 3,000 feet, outside of the city limits, even on the Sabbath, without being considered as having left your city area. Now, that specific interpretation is only known from later sources. It is, by the way, mentioned in this New Testament passage because of the fact that we hear here that there is a distance to the Mount of Olives, which is considered to be a Sabbath day's journey. What's a Sabbath day's journey? It's 2,000 cubits, 3,000 feet. Guess how far it is from the wall of Jerusalem, which was, by the way, the wall of the Temple Mount at that time, on the eastern side of the Temple Mount, not the western wall side, the other side. It turns out to be about 3,000 cubits to the edge of the Mount of Olives, as you can see here. And if you would take that walk, it would take you, about 20 minutes or so, and that's what we're talking about here. Now, at Gezer, there are all over the place boundary stones that were found that mark out the same boundary. It says there, Tchum Gezer, the boundary of Gezer in Hebrew, and it's for this purpose. And the earliest literary evidence that we have of this particular interpretation is right here, and you see it being practiced. Now, I guess it's not too important because it's so obvious, but the New Testament mentions all the regular Jewish holidays. Pentecost, which is Shavuot, and Paul wanted to celebrate that in Jerusalem, I assume because he wanted to be at the temple when the sacrifices were offered. Passover, of course, but it's really interesting. I skipped one over here, but in any case, right, Paul wanted to be in Jerusalem on Pentecost, and then Passover. And you notice right after the days of the unleavened bread, which is the festival of the week of Passover, right after that, they were prepared to travel because apparently, sounds like even Paul and his comrades did not travel on the Jewish holiday. Presumably they were observing that holiday. Now, of course, you would have known from a lot of later material that traveling on these holidays was forbidden. I don't know exactly where you would have known it otherwise except for such passages. Now, a very interesting thing that we find already in the Dead Sea Scrolls, David is considered like a prophet. And there is numerous evidence in antiquity that people consider David to be a prophet. And we indeed find this in the New Testament. And we have the discussion of his tomb, which of course exists until today. I don't know if that's really his tomb. I once saw the then chief rabbi of Israel arguing with the great archaeologist Yigael Yadin about this place. And the then chief rabbi, Rabbi Gorin, who was known to be quite controversial, but in any case, right, he said quite loudly on the TV that he has never prayed at the so-called tomb of David, which he assumes is not the tomb of David. The tomb of David is, by the way, below the canoculum, which is the room in which it is believed the Last Supper took place. And some of you may know that from 1400 until today, there has been an ongoing court case, still never resolved, about who owns that room. However, despite the fact that all these Christian groups are debating who owns that room, there is today apparently a Jewish yeshiva in that room. But one way or another, right, that tomb apparently existed already at this time. But the point that I want to make for you is that this idea of the widening of who's a prophet is very important. We have here our colleague Alex Jason, whose doctoral dissertation deals with the, in a certain sense, types of ongoing prophecy after the Hebrew Bible prophets ended. And there's a lot of evidence that he brings from Dead Sea Scrolls and other Second Temple material, but actually there's evidence even here or there in some later rabbinic passages, and we see that here in the New Testament. Again, this idea of continuation of prophecy. Now, we also have some interesting information about prayer. So Peter and John want to go to the temple for the hour of prayer at 3 o'clock. The temple, of course, is the Jerusalem temple. Now, according to Mishnaic sources, in the last years of the temple, there was indeed a type of synagogue service, that is to say, a prayer service, as opposed to a sacrificial service going on in the temple. Now, there are scholars who've been saying for years that none of these things in the Mishnah are historical and they're not really accurate. Well, the New Testament shows that afternoon prayers were being recited at 3 o'clock at the Jerusalem temple in the style of a synagogue service. And of course, this is the same time that the sacrifice was being offered, which is essentially the so-called afternoon sacrifice to which the afternoon prayer is supposed to correspond. So here we again have the example of an early citation of a Jewish practice that we would have known from earlier texts, but we wouldn't have been able to show that it really happened in the temple. Now I have to just pause to say something funny. Some Judaic scholars who believe that nothing should be believed often tell me when I quote something like this, no, this doesn't prove anything. Just like the Mishnah was written way afterwards, so this was written way afterwards. So how could you say that a text, which is, let's say, completed in, for the sake of argument, 85 or 90 or something like that, would give an accurate picture of what went on before? Well, so my question to them is it just a coincidence that the Mishnah and the early Christian writings both dreamt up that there was an afternoon synagogue-type service, and for that matter, a morning-type service, going on in the temple in its last years as prayer was gradually overtaking sacrifice, and as sacrifice was about to disappear from Jewish ritual? This is just a coincidence? And by the way, their answer is yes. Okay, so praying in the temple was a normal thing, and we should not be surprised that it was going on here. Now, we know that according to Josephus, beginning in about 150 BCE, the main sectarian groups were the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Now, of course, everybody here knows that the Essenes are most commonly identified by most scholars, it's the most popular view, with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a disappointment to those of us who work on the scrolls of the Essenes, whether they are the same or not, that neither the Talmud nor the New Testament has any direct mention of these people. In fact, the people they mention over and over in both the Talmudic sources and in the New Testament are the Pharisees and Sadducees. It's very clear that whether the Essenes or the Dead Sea sect are not, the Essenes were not leading players, nor were the Dead Sea sectarians in the main issues going on in Jerusalem. Hence, Jesus is always pictured, and the later Christians, by we say later, I mean the Christians previous to the completion of Luke Acts, are always pictured as debating Pharisees and Sadducees. So it seems very clear that we have here evidence that these are the main points of view. Now, in the case of the resurrection of the dead, the argument pertaining to who believed in what, which is given here in Acts 4, is exactly what would have gathered from some later rabbinic sources, as well as from Josephus, who's, by the way, roughly contemporaneous, writing towards the end of the first century, with the Gospels and certainly with Luke Acts. Now, we do need to remember that they are closely linked with this group of high priestly families, who are in turn closely linked with some, or the Pharisees are in turn closely linked with some group called the Scribes. Now, these are clearly all of your elites. Now, the problem is that we're not sure about how to relate the Scribes to the Pharisees. I frankly have nothing original or new to say about this. They're mentioned together. Scribes, according to the rabbinic tradition, are often simply teachers of Scripture, not really copyists. But of course, we know there also were copyists. And we know that the job of copyists was also to correct texts. We know that that went on according to rabbinic tradition in the temple. And we know that rabbinic sources group scribes with Pharisees as a kind of forerunner. We also know that in the last years of Judea, and this is described very well by Martin Goodman in some of his studies, we know that the priests were basically not simply an elite, but they were an elite who was supposed to keep the local Jews under control and mediate with the Romans. Goodman argues that it's their failure which touched off the revolt against Rome. I'm not so sure, because the elements that revolted started revolting when the Rome conquered the land of Israel in 63 BCE. And they started revolting because they believed that Jews had to live under a Jewish government and not under a foreign government. It was a kind of Maccabean proto-nationalism, if you could call it that. And so I'm not sure that Goodman's right about what caused the revolt, but he's certainly right that these families, including Caiaphas, who of course is mentioned in the New Testament, were this elite that was supposed to keep people quiet. Now, despite the fact that they competed with the Pharisees religiously and even politically, there's no question that these people all knew they were the elite. It's sort of like the lawyers against the doctors in our society. They know that they're part of a kind of major elite of the society, even if they're slinging it out over whether or not there should or should not be, no fault for doctors or various types of lawsuits. But they all know that they have a common interest in a kind of professionalism, which is a form of elitism. Now, the point is that all of these groups are mentioned in the New Testament, and it's very clear that they do constitute their such elites. And this is, of course, in consonance with Josephus, but there's a lot that we can learn of specifics from the New Testament passage, perhaps about too detailed for our discussion right now. But we could see that, for example, in this passage from Acts, and we have here an example of how the high priest, along with the Sadducees, is functioning as a kind of civil ruler in the context of the Roman government. This is nothing new. Anybody who read Josephus would know this, but the New Testament projects this as well. Now we have this notion about the Pharisees and Sadducees pertaining to resurrection. And what's interesting about this whole question is that when Paul eventually is being tried, everybody seems to agree in the Pharisaic side that the views that he is expressing is correct. But the text has to, along the way, tell us. This reminds me of the text in Mark 7 that has to tell you the rules of ritual purity according to the rabbis, because the people reading it don't know. But you know how fantastic it is for us to have those statements about ritual purity and be able to show that things that we see the Dead Sea sectarians doing and things that we see the rabbis describing the Pharisees as doing were indeed done by Pharisees in the period. And so the same thing here goes with these early accounts dealing with who believed and who did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. There was a tremendous debate about whether this was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's quite clear now that the whole corpus has been published that it is found, but is admittedly resurrection of the dead is found in less passages than you might have thought. And it's interesting to see that the Sadducees did not believe in it, and of course the Pharisees and others did. Now, burial. This is like really interesting. And even though right now we just have a few short passages, I want to point out that actually the New Testament discussions of the burial of Jesus actually provide us with some very important information about the preparation and anointing of bodies for burial and the dressing of bodies for burial. Because we have evidence of this in Talmudic sources. There is no earlier evidence of any of this anywhere. The idea that the body is cleansed, anointed, and wrapped in a certain way for burial according to Jewish law, the earliest source again, right here in the New Testament. So you'll tell me that this isn't really valid because your rabbinic sources, some of them are even as late as the 7th and 8th centuries for this stuff, right? Apparently, here you see it. And by the way, I don't think I have to tell this audience not to believe any of this nonsense about someone claiming that they found Jesus' grave and his DNA in Talpiot in Jerusalem. This type of stuff is all, essentially nonsense. Every single Easter and every Christmas, it comes on television again because of the fact that you can make a lot of money saying these things, but they're simply not accurate. I mean, if we had his DNA, it would be great. Then we'd be able to check out whether he really moved, according to the Da Vinci Code, to France, and whether or not there are any descendants left, who then, by the way, I don't know if you know too much about this, but these claims were made by Vichy pro-Nazi people that they had people who supposedly were really descendants of Jesus, and therefore, so this stuff is very connected up with some very unsavory stuff as well. Not meaning at all to point such fingers at the modern authors who've made money by telling the stories, but somewhat earlier, there's some very distasteful background in some of these ideas. But what can you do? Now, the Sanhedrin. This is a problem that nobody can answer, but the New Testament has been crucial in the discussion. First of all, what I did was I modified the translation here to tell you when Sanhedrin appears, because you might not even realize that the text is talking about the Sanhedrin. And according to rabbinic sources, the Sanhedrin is a bunch of rabbis who follow Mishnaic law, and in Josephus, when he describes the trial of Herod for basically executing criminals without trial, that's what he did, and when it describes, these criminals were sort of rebels, but they were criminals, but he gave them no trial. And when it describes in the New Testament the trial of Jesus, and then the trial of Stephen, what you discover is that you have a completely different Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin dominated by Sadducee priests, which seemed to function not according to the laws of the Mishnah, but according to another pattern. Now, I can't really solve this problem except to say it's pretty apparent that the material in Josephus, which is in complete agreement with the material in the New Testament, is telling us what the Sanhedrin was in Second Temple times, and the rabbinic texts are telling us what the rabbis would have liked. I should tell you that the very same rabbinic tractate called Sanhedrin that tells you in chapter 1 how the Sanhedrin would be structured, proceeds to tell you, they don't call it the Sanhedrin, they call it the Great Court, proceeds to tell you in the next chapter how the high priest would function and how the king would function. And of course, there had not been a real Jewish king since Hebrew Bible times. So it's clearly putting forward an ideal, and the New Testament helps us to know that the Sanhedrin that is described in Josephus is the Sanhedrin. Now, there later came up a two-Sanhedrin theory, in which some rabbinic scholars who are a little bit less willing to admit the truth than I am, tried to claim that there were two Sanhedrins, and that in Second Temple times, at the time even of Jesus' trial, that there were two different courts, a rabbinic one and another one. The only problem is that our evidence seems to convince us that there really was one, and that the one is the one that we see described in the New Testament and Josephus. So here, I have to say, this is a question of chicken and egg, because if you had the New Testament, then you read Josephus, you would conclude that this proves to you, Josephus proves to you that the New Testament is correct and the Mishnaic account is an idealistic one. But if you read Josephus first I'm sorry, yeah. And if you read the New Testament first, these are chiefest. Whichever one you read first, you conclude the other one proves that the other one's right. But I think what it really amounts to is that they're both right, and they agree with one another, and they give us this picture of a Sadducee-dominated Sanhedrin, which can explain to us quite a number of things. It can explain to us why the Pharisees are often pictured as being in opposition on ritual matters. And it can explain to us why there's been some strife described in rabbinic sources that even went on in the temple. And it can explain to us as well why some people protested against that Sadducean system circa 150 BCE or so and formed the Dead Sea sect. Now, some other evidence here regarding the Sanhedrin. We see it was led by the high priest. It functioned as a council. It had elders of Israel. The elders of Israel in the Mishnah are the Pharisees. Apparently, the Pharisees were part of the Sanhedrin as a minority second group. They simply didn't dominate it. This stuff is discussed in a book by Jacob Neusner called From Politics to Piety. It's a kind of a popular volume, and I think he basically got this right in terms of the Pharisees being secondary during much of this period. But here, the New Testament is a part of our picture along with Josephus. Now, very interesting is simply the mention of the Pharisee Gamaliel, otherwise known as Rabban Gamliel in Mishnaic parlance, or known as Rabban Gamliel the Elder. The fact that he was a kind of open-minded guy who said, you know what, let's not attack these Christians physically. Let's leave them alone and see what happens. And if it turns out that they're right, they'll be right. It's sort of, I think there's some wisecrack that's always made by various Jewish leaders, which is we'll just wait around. And if someone comes, we'll ask him if it's the second time you've been here or the first time you've been here. And these wisecracks, right, seem to display a position similar to Rabban Gamliel. Let's just leave the situation alone, and we'll eventually see who is or is not a Messianic Redeemer. But the point that is so great for me is to see a sage that is known otherwise only from the Mishnah, where again you could argue, how do you know this is historical? And here we find the man is a walking, living individual who exists and is mentioned in the New Testament exactly as what he truly was, a teacher of the law, respected by all the people. Now, you know that there is a very common notion that along with the Sadducean dominance, that because the Sadducees dominated the political affairs at this time, the claim of Josephus and the later rabbis that the dominant group was, let's call them Pharisaic retainers, not the inner core of the Pharisees, but those who sort of followed the Pharisaic way. And some modern scholars don't believe this. They question it. It seems to me that, I'm not going to claim this proves it's true, but it seems to me that this statement certainly points in that direction, that you have a Pharisaic sage known from rabbinic sources that we find he's respected by everybody. Not an easy thing, by the way. But the point that I would make is, I'm not claiming this is a proof, but it's a sort of piece of evidence that certainly helps to generally think that there's credibility to some of this stuff. Now, even Paul refers to Rabban Gamaliel, and certainly identifies him as a major teacher. Whether he's exaggerating, Paul is exaggerating. You see, this is a good example I went before. It doesn't tell us that Paul really studied with Rabban Gamliel, but it says that Rabban Gamliel is someone that the author of Luke Acts knows, everybody knows. And if you say you studied with him, then the reader knows it. And that's why, to my mind, the question of the historicity of the parts about Paul, Jesus, etc., is not what we're after here. I'm not saying that it's not true. Is that we don't have anything to do with that question. The question we have is, can we believe these sort of off-the-cuff mentions of these people? Now, Messianic movements. It's very interesting. The New Testament mentions some Messianic movements and helps us to fill in information. This Theudas fellow, who led some people around in the Messianic movement that the Romans eventually killed. Judas the Galilean, we know that the family of Judah the Galilean was a central force in the rebel groups, continuing to rebel through the entire Roman period and running up through the coalescing of the various rebel groups in the rebellion against Rome in 66 CE, which started in 66 and ended, of course, with the destruction of the temple in 70, and Masada being destroyed in 73, and in between most of the land being destroyed. So what I would like to say about this is that when you have this discussion, this is census which took place in the year 6, this is part of the protest against the Herodians continuing to rule. And the bottom line is that what you find here is that these rebellions are being referred to. We have some information from the New Testament, some information from Josephus. When we put it together, we can basically come up with a dating and understanding. Another fellow was called the Egyptian. The Egyptian assembled thousands of people. Josephus talks about this too. Let them out in the wilderness. They were going to go out there to find the Messiah. Instead, they found the Roman army, and they were all massacred. So it's really interesting that the New Testament talks about these Messianic movements. Here I want to caution you about something, which is not really our topic today, but rather something about the history of Judaism and Christianity. There are various terms that you hear bandied about. For example, you hear that the land of Israel swarmed with sects, or that there were hundreds of Messiah figures and stuff like this. Now, I have to tell you that I can count 6 people that could be compared in a certain way as teachers to Jesus, and I can count about 20 possible sectarian groups that might be compared to the early Christians. Now, never mind the negative connotation of a term like swarmed, but it doesn't seem to me that that's swarming. We can count and should study and compare those figures, like the Messianic figures I just mentioned, to which we can make some comparison. And we should look at the larger group of sectarian groups of the period. But we should not fall into the false assumption that this is just massive numbers. I don't know where these ideas come from. Now, let's talk a little about synagogues. In Jerusalem itself, there was a synagogue of diaspora Jews. This is the period in which we know the synagogue is developing. The first archaeological synagogues that we have are from the 1st century CE. They are Masada, Gamla, and Herodian, 3 in the land of Israel. Previous to that, we don't have any synagogue buildings, and when you go to visit, for example, if anyone has been at the synagogue at Capernaum, this may have been, probably was, a 1st century synagogue that Jesus himself sat in, but the building you're looking at is from much later. It's from 5th, 6th century, the remains of the building you're looking at. By the way, an interesting fact, in the same period, there was a church right next door. And if you stuck your arm out of the window of the synagogue, you could shake hands with your neighbor who was in the church. Just interesting fact about the way these communities. Now take a look where these freed men used to be slaves. Were the Cyrenaeans from North Africa, Alexandrians, others from Cilicia and Asia Minor. Anyhow, they were all there in that synagogue. Now also we have synagogues being discussed all over the place. Now let me quickly tell you, we're going to see that the book of Acts tells us about the whole Jewish diaspora in the Greco-Roman area. That is to say, the Western diaspora. So for example, we hear about the synagogue in Salamis and in Cyprus, and we're going to see a lot more. Seleucia. Now, let me just tell you something very important. There's a big historical debate about whether to accept the stories of Paul and his friends going to all these synagogues, where they start out their work in a place by hanging out with the Jews. They think they can convince some of them to accept Christianity. They either do or do not succeed, and then they, in some cases, get expelled from the synagogue. In some cases, stay welcome, but then they go out and try to convert some non-Jews, pagans, basically, which, of course, is the history of the Gentile church coming into being at this time. But here's the point I want to make. The debate runs like this, that the epistles do not mention this whole synagogue-oriented activity, which is mentioned over and over in the book of Acts. Here's where, again, it doesn't matter for our lecture tonight whether it's true or not. What matters is that Acts tells us that there were synagogues in all these places, and we have, in many cases, archaeological evidence for synagogues just a bit later. And we have, in many cases, these rights documents from Josephus. So the whole thing seems to fit together very well. Now, what's interesting also is that many of these synagogues were built on the seashore. And here you have a little mention in Acts 16, the Sabbath, they're looking to go to the synagogue. So what do? You don't know where it is. Now, by the way, you see this word place of prayer. Synagogos is the Jewish community in this period. Prosuche is the room you pray in. The actual, what we would call the synagogue room, or what's called in most synagogues today, the sanctuary. Now, we see here they're looking for one. They don't know where it is. So what happened? they're looking, and so they go down to the seashore, because actually many of the synagogues were actually built on the seashore. Apparently, there was some kind of idea of purity there. And Jews built their synagogues in those places. Now, they find this woman who's a worshiper of God. This is probably one of the so-called semi-proselytes. And then we also have another example where they're going to look for a synagogue. Now, synagogues were all over in Asia Minor and in various other places, and it's quite amazing how many of them there were. For example, in ancient Rome, the location of no synagogue has been found. But it's known that there were quite a number of synagogues around. And this makes sense considering the number of Jews who are buried in the catacombs, but that's a bit later than our period. But nonetheless, what seems to be is that many of the synagogues on this map are from a bit later, but when you tie together the general picture of Acts with the general picture of Josephus's rights documents and these places, it seems like there was quite a robust community way before the destruction of the temple, obviously fed by a combination of sort of like just people happened to go to places, but more than that, following various armies and setting up businesses and international trade and all kinds of things which we in our modern period understand well and sometimes like to call globalization. Now, for some reason, we have evidence here that the high priests could actually control what went on in diaspora synagogues. Imagine that Paul, at the time when he was still persecuting the Christians, got letters from the high priest that he was able to bring to synagogues that would be listened to. So apparently the temple priesthood had some influence over the Jewish communities in various places, and especially if you brought their letters from Jerusalem. Now, Sabbath services were a main activity that went on regularly. They included, as you see here in verse 15, the reading of the law and the prophets. In fact, the texts we have from this period don't describe too much of the prayers. But you see, here's the problem. In the translation, it says place of prayer, so you think they're praying there. In the Greek, it says proseuche. So some scholars have argued that they didn't pray in these places, they only read the Torah. I personally don't agree with this because of the large numbers of prayers in the Dead Sea Scrolls that seem to me to indicate that prayer was developing in this time as a daily activity that could then move into the synagogue. But I have to admit to you that when you examine these passages, you might be fooled because of the terminology, synagogue, place of prayer, etc., that the texts basically speak about reading and studying the Torah. Now, also, you see Paul getting up to speak. It seemed to be that people often gave speeches, sermons in synagogues. Now, Josephus says that in the land of Israel, they went on in the afternoon. That is to say, people would go home from Sabbath services in the morning, they would come back in the afternoon, and they would listen to some type of speech or sermon or something like this. However, what seems to be the case in some of these Asia Minor synagogues, and also in the Judean and, well, I should say the Galilean synagogues, because Jesus also gets up and gives expositions, is that there were sermons going on essentially at the services on Sabbath morning, which of course should not surprise us. It shows that some things have never ever changed. And then also note the presence of the synagogues of converts. So apparently there were three kinds of people there. There were regular Jews, there were semi-proselytes, who were these people who accepted certain Jewish rituals, and then there were real converts. Now, Torah reading is going on in all these places, and even the claim, isn't this amazing, that Moses somehow or another is the originator of the reading of the Torah, a claim that's made in rabbinic sources. But certainly the source tells us that all these synagogues are reading the Torah. Now, if you ask me, how did they decorate the scroll? Did they have those famous two lions on the front? Was it like a Sephardic Torah scroll, which, by the way, I think it was from Talmudic sources, that was in a case or in a cloth wrapping? You know, I can't answer a lot of these questions. Just be aware that a lot of the modern things that people are used to come from Europe. And they don't really indicate what went on in this very, very early period. But nonetheless, the idea that there was an ark, that they took out a Torah, that they read from it, is just pretty amazing parallels. And as we mentioned before, they read the words of prophets. And notice what it says. The prophets are read every week. That is what's called the Haftarah, which is still being read in synagogues until today. Now, by the way, it's interesting in that passage that some of the people didn't understand it. Now we have, again, Paul in the synagogue. And here he is out in Thessalonica. And I actually had the privilege of being there, I guess it's 2 years ago or so. Anyhow, so what does he do? He goes to the synagogue, and here we see that he's arguing with the Jews. We're going to see in a few minutes, don't worry, we're only going on another hour and a half. This is no problem. We'll not be talking. We're going to see in a few minutes that the Jews generally reject Paul and his associates for the most part. And then, of course, I think some of you know that they are also fighting against other types of missionaries who are preaching a Jewish Christianity that requires that you convert despite the Council of Jerusalem that's described in Acts. But despite that fact, right, we find that there are all these passages in which they go to the synagogue, and some places they're receptive, and some places they kick them out. Different things happen, but they're arguing with the Jews in the synagogues all over the place. Now, so in any case, by the way, it's also interesting to note that they appear to be using Hebrew Bibles, but not always. Look at this passage. Following the Septuagint, in which the Bible has the reading of 75 having gone down to Egypt, but it's found in a Hebrew Bible in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a whole subject. The New Testament is evidence for the still not totally fixed nature of the Hebrew Scriptures, which is itself in evidence in the Septuagint that was used by the editors, authors, whatever, of Christian sources and most of Josephus to provide a Bible in Greek, and which was the Greek Bible of numerous Jews in the diaspora, with a few fragments even being found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it seems to be that many of these Jews may have really read the Torah in Greek, which our rabbinic sources say went on in Alexandria, which of course is the place where the Septuagint had been created. So this is a very, very complicated question about the Hebrew Bible text of the New Testament. It's been debated forever. It's again one of those questions that can't be totally solved, but it does seem, whatever, that Greek Bibles were well known. Now just a few words about magic. Magic is apparently quite common among the groups which fed into Christianity, and apparently quite common among Jews. And this is clear from all kinds of sources, from amulets that have been found, from rabbinic sources, from non-Jewish sources that absorb Jewish magic, and from the New Testament as well. In fact, it led to the very controversial book, Jesus the Magician by Morton Smith, in which he argued that Jesus was just a magician, basically, from beginning to end. And even though that's exaggerated, it's interesting to see that magic was also practiced, as you see here, in a diaspora type situation, by people that are sort of big shots, in not simply by these Jewish exorcists, but others, but you have priests and you have all kinds of individuals involved in magic and exorcism. This is an area which does deserve a lot more research, but there is no question we have magic and exorcism in Dead Sea Scrolls. We have it in rabbinic texts. It seems to be that it was quite common, and so we should not be surprised that it's found in various New Testament passages. And it is considered to be closely related to prophecy. This is a whole subject which would not simply take more time to explain, but it would take me a lot of research to be able to explain, because there's a tremendous amount of material about this. But what is clear without any question is that you have people that are part of the aristocracy of the Roman Empire who are making use of magic, and hence we should not be surprised about that. Paphos, of course, is in Cyprus, and you have this sort of half false prophet, half magician running around, and of course Simon Magus, whose entire reputation was based on magic. And some more evidence here that people actually believed in prophets, which fits in with some evidence, even though I'm writing a paper right now that shows that for the rabbis, I really do believe that prophecy did end with the end of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's quite clear that there were some Jewish groups and Jewish individuals for whom prophecy was continuing even beyond, and we should not be surprised to find that in our New Testament evidence. Now I want to emphasize again that when we read the accounts of Jews coming into contact with Paul and with his colleagues, the overwhelming content is one of rejection, although the New Testament text, and especially Acts, do tell us of some people who accepted the ideas of Christianity, Apparently they were a minority. Apparently this is the cause of the fact that so many Christians were derived from the so-called Gentiles who joined the new church, seeing in it a lot of positive things that perhaps they may have even seen in Judaism, which may have led some to become semi-proselytes. But at any rate, what seems to be clear is that in Asia Minor, more non-Jews were interested in the church than Jews. And I think if you read the rejection passages fairly, you'll come up with this. I tell you very frankly, I'm not sure the rejection passages have been read honestly, and I'll tell you why. Because, of course, in our own time, there has been the whole debate about the relationship of the Jews to the crucifixion. And so I think there's a kind of oversensitivity to the admission that as Christianity spread, in most places, most of the Jewish communities rejected these ideas. I think they don't really want to say that too loud. But I think historically we have to admit the truth that the Christian ideas were for the most part, but of course not totally rejected, but for the most part rejected by the Jewish groups. And you see here another passage, right, in which basically this is what happens, and you've got actually a situation in which Jews are plotting and working against the spread of this new movement, and coupled with the fact that there are these Jewish Christians who believe that to become a Christian you have to, if you're a male, get circumcised, and no matter what, convert to Judaism first, who are roaming around the very same, we could call it territory, as Paul and his followers, and coming before or after with teachings that are constantly being polemicized against, both in Acts and I think in the epistles as well. And here you see in Corinth the same kind of situation in which all kinds of accusations were made against him. And again, we could show even more examples of this. Furthermore, we have evidence in this material that circumcision was expected by Jews, which I think is pretty obvious from any intelligent reading of these texts. But I have to tell you something very interesting. There's an account in Josephus about the conversion of the royal house of Adiabene. And actually some scholars tried to argue there that that passage does not assume that circumcision is necessary for conversion. I've argued against this because what happens is that when the prince of Adiabene is told by his friends, don't circumcise yourself because you're going to get in trouble with your subjects, it doesn't mean that they're saying, this is a Jewish guy, I made a mistake there. It's not his friends, it's a Jewish teacher. Tells him, don't get yourself circumcised because it will cause you trouble with your subjects. It's not that he's arguing it's okay to become a Jew without being circumcised. He's arguing stay like one of these semi-proselytes. Don't go through with actual conversion because your subjects will not be willing to have you stay as their king if you convert to Judaism. Now, the point I want to make here is that there is rabbinic material in which these statements are made over and over the same way. And I think that it's clear from all the discussions in Acts of this topic that circumcision was required for conversion to Judaism already at this time. I don't know how you can understand the inner dynamic of what happens in the decision to include Gentiles in the wider Israel that Paul is proclaiming, if you don't assume that the Jews require circumcision to be a Jew. And I think that this material just shows that as well. Also, the concept of the Noachide laws. The Talmud tells us later on that according to Jewish law, non-Jews have to observe certain laws if they want to be good people. If they observe these laws, there's a basic ethically kind of things that we know, and belief in God. If they observe these laws, they go to the next world. They receive reward, what Christians call salvation, and the Jews call the next world, the world to come. And then it's great. They don't have any obligation to be Jews, and they're good people, and that's great. Now, this notion appears to be found already in these texts because you see that the Gentiles still have to be told, according to the council in Jerusalem, they have to be told that they have to abstain from things polluted by idols, because that's a denial of the one God, and from fornication, which of course is Paul's problem after he's misunderstood by people who think, that anything goes if the law is not required. But of course, this is the so-called Noachide laws as well, the morality. And then they can't eat what has been strangled and from blood, which seems to be very similar to the rabbinic assumption that it's forbidden for non-Jews to eat meat that has been taken live off an animal while the animal's still alive and to eat it. But even if it's not exactly that, even if it means that they don't want animals to be slaughtered by strangulation, it's still in the ballpark of these Noachide laws. And again, abstention from sacrifice to idols and blood and what is strangled, the same business. It's quite on fornication, which is, by the way, a word that nobody knows unless they study the Bible, the word, right? So the point that I want to make to you is that what you see here is that this whole concept we know from later on seems to have already existed at this time. Now, we also have discussions here of Christians being expelled from certain places, but how did this all get going? What was really going on? Well, it seems that Paul was going every single Sabbath to the synagogue and trying to convince Jews and Greeks to join in this new approach. Now, a really interesting thing is a Nazirite vow. Before I tell you this, I have to tell you a funny story. Years ago, I got a phone call. I really didn't know what to say. I was kind of embarrassed. From a guy who had invited me to lecture at his Christian seminary. He wanted to know if it would be offensive to his local Reform synagogue if he asked if he, as a non-Jew, could come there to fulfill a Nazirite vow. He apparently thought that he could go to the Reform synagogue, cut his hair, put the hair into some type of a device, and burn it and offer animal sacrifices. And when I explained to him that no synagogue practices Nazirite laws anymore, he was like amazed. And I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was like sort of like, destroying his whole concept. He'd kept the whole Nazirite vow, thinking he could go to the synagogue and fulfill it. But I want to point out that we don't really know that people were keeping Nazirite vows in the last years of the Second Temple. We just know that the Torah discusses it, and that it's debated like crazy among the rabbis in the Mishnah and Talmud, and they don't want you to do it. They think, I'm not going to say they think it's crazy, they think it's too ascetic, and that it was only put into the Torah for somebody who, because of really bad behavior in the past, needs to be gotten under control by taking these kind of extreme vows, but that it's not for your regular pious person to deny these types of things in their life. And here we see that it was actually being done and being fulfilled by Jews who don't even live in the land of Israel. And that out there near Corinth, at the seaport, you could have a haircut to fulfill the Nazirite vows. And indeed, we have the story that Paul donated the donations of the sacrifices for Nazirites, which also indicates again that in the Jerusalem temple this was happening, that the purification and sacrifice was all being observed. We would not know this without this evidence. Now, a really interesting thing is that we learn that when Paul went to the temple, there was a kind of a rumor that he had brought a non-Jew to the temple. Now, actually, bringing a non-Jew to the temple is forbidden, and there's an inscription that you really can't see, which, in any case, was put up all along the boundaries of the inner part of the Temple Mount to say, up to here, non-Jews can go. They can't go any further. You can come into the temple area, but you can only go so far. Now, the point is that Paul was accused of that. Now, this we would have known from these inscriptions. We might not have known that it was a live discussion, but it's interesting to see that live discussion. So now, for those who think we've been talking too long, which perhaps we have, we are now ready to draw some conclusions. So first of all, there's an interesting fact about the New Testament that differs from virtually any other Jewish documents that we have. I've called it an inner-outer Jewish document. What do I mean by that? Today, there's a lot of discussion in scholarship. I think some scholars want to exaggerate the extent to which the New Testament is inside Judaism. It seems to me that it's part inside and end on the way out. It's a kind of moving item, right? Moving target, maybe. Because it's inner from the point of view of much of its background, what we didn't really talk about today. It's inner because it has so much information about the Jews that we can learn all kinds of really fascinating things. And it's inner because it's produced originally by people who, in many of them, are Jews and believe in many Jewish things. It's outer because it's a group that's in the process, for various reasons, of becoming what we would call a different religion. It's also outer because there are things in it that are in fundamental disagreement with what at least it would appear from a fair study of Jewish sources, ironically including the New Testament, are the normative beliefs of most of the Jews, even taking into account the sectarian groups that we know existed. Now, of course, one of the reasons that it's so key to helping us to understand about Judaism is because Judaism is not simply what's in the rabbinic texts. It was what was going on in all these places in Asia Minor and North Africa, and we didn't talk so much about it, but the Eastern Diaspora as well. And in all of these communities, you have this kind of, you could almost call it a morass of widespread Judaism, which has not yet become standardized under the rabbinic banner, obviously. But despite that fact, there are all types of things that are just always the same, and you see them. So, just in one personal experience, went to Sardis, and Sardis has an entablature of the Ark that almost looks like you're in but an almost modern type synagogue. And then they have 2 reading tables, for reading the Torah, whatever. The point is, you look around at the place, and you see that there are enormous continuities, while there are differences and discontinuities that are both discontinuous historically and discontinuous, I'm saying both, we need more than 2 things. They're historically discontinuous, they're geographically discontinuous, while also being continuous, right? And yet, at some point, of course, there is some kind of limitation that comes into being. We have enormous information about the Greco-Roman diaspora in these Christian sources. I only gave you, an hour and 10 minutes of it. One could gather much more and talk about every one of these in much greater detail. Now, when we come to what we're talking about the integration of Jews and Judaism in the ancient world, virtually none of the stuff we're talking about here will ever get into any ancient history book. And the reason it doesn't get into any ancient history book is because for some reason these books don't really care about these subjects. Now, I was reading a history of Mesopotamia, and the guy is discussing various religious groups in Mesopotamia, and then he has a statement, there also was a large Jewish community. In a footnote, see Jacob News, The History of the Jews in Babylonia. It never occurred to him that if he would read all the translated Talmudic texts about Babylonia that are in this book, he might learn something about Babylonia in general. I would submit to you that not only do we learn this material about Jews and Judaism, but there's tremendous amount of information about what it was like in these places and what was going in these places and what kind of businesses took place in these things. And the New Testament provides a lot of that, and other sources that are primarily concerned with Judaism and Christianity do as well. Now, the problem is that what happens is that the history of Judaism and the history of Christianity, they finally are considered a lot together. Now, everybody should come tomorrow because we're going to have great papers. And when you hear the papers tomorrow, there's one thing I think you should watch out for. You should watch out for scholars trained in Christianity, how much they know about Judaism, and scholars trained in Judaism, how much they know about Christianity. And unbeknownst to many people, the sort of confraternity of all these people and the personal relations and the friendships are so great, and the knowledge that's exchanged is so great, that integration has taken place academically. But yet the integration of this material into the wider field still is missing, we could say, in most of what is done. And there is enormous stuff here. I tried to give you some examples of what you can learn about Judaism from these Christian sources. If you read them as if you're not interested in what they're really about, this is a sort of a dangerous method. You read a book, you're not interested in what the author's trying to say. You're interested in what you want to drag out of it, which he just told you because of the setting. So I would leave you and tell you not to read the New Testament as if what the author says doesn't matter. That's okay for me. But when you're reading the New Testament and other ancient sources, ask yourself sometimes, what can I learn about subjects that the author was not writing about from some of the information he preserves that we would not have known otherwise? Thank you very much.